The United Methodist Church, on March 3, 2024, concluded its long-delayed and highly anticipated General Conference. As a reminder, the General Conference is the voting body that sets the official laws and doctrine of the entire denomination. While all expected a significant shift, so many were unprepared for the severity of the changes that came. Needless to say, there will be fallout. And while the news is still fresh and much of the fallout hasn't even begun to settle, there are immediate results that have changed the United Methodist Church forever. Wading through the timeline of the General Conference is difficult, but I hope to provide a concise update to the history that has unfolded in our lifetime. The most obvious change to come about was what many were expecting: the removal of the prohibitions in the United Methodist Book of Discipline concerning practicing homosexual clergy. This also includes permission for any clergy to perform homosexual weddings. This is far, far from the only change, and some will find the coming changes I will describe even more shocking. But it is the most reported change in the media. The language of the new Book of Discipline strikes out a line that existed in their polity since 1972, which said, "The practice of homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching." By removing this line, it effectively allows bishops to consider homosexual clergy. But now it goes quite a bit further. This provision now says that annual conferences, the regional voting body of the Church, should honor the denomination's commitment not to reject practicing homosexual members. This change is significant because the United Methodists were, until now, the only mainline denomination to still have those prohibitions in place. The Evangelical Lutheran Church in America changed its polity in 2009. The Presbyterian Church USA made the changes in 2011 and 2014. The Episcopal Church had openly homosexual clergy since 1990, with formal approval for homosexual marriages in 2015. Perhaps the most notorious, the United Church of Christ, has allowed openly homosexual clergy since 1972, with homosexual marriages blessed in 2005. Why then did it take the United Methodists so long when other mainline denominations gave in years before? The most significant reason was because of mounting pressure from the quickly growing African missions of the United Methodists, which are largely traditional in their views. And that remains true to this day. African United Methodists are very traditional in their theology and hold the majority, the growing majority, in the United Methodist Church. Tensions for this General Conference had been mounting for years. If you are unsure of how the United Methodists found themselves in their current predicament, the history of this latest tension, beginning from 2016 and moving through the end of 2023, please watch my other video on the events. A link is in the description and above. The vote to change the Book of Discipline on this matter was 692 to 51. Suffice to say, you may remember that the traditional plan, which kept those prohibitions in place, passed in 2019 with a majority vote of a special session of the General Conference, 438 to 384. If Africa was growing, how did this seismic shift happen? That involves the extreme controversy, which I will explain after my summary. What should also be said is that after the stunning vote to change the Book of Discipline, some of the later votes were much closer, but still far above the majority. One change that seems a bit strange to some is the removal of another line that was not generally considered offensive to most. The expectation of clergy in the United Methodist Church, and indeed all of Christianity, was that ministers would practice a certain level of decorum in romantic relations. Christian teaching for the entire history of the Church stated that the marriage bed was the only acceptable place for intimate relations between men and women. The denomination had a line in paragraph 304 of the Book of Discipline, describing the relational expectations of pastors, specifically of fidelity in marriage and celibacy in singleness. This line was removed from the new Book of Discipline, now replaced with this: social responsibility and faithful sexual intimacy expressed through fidelity, monogamy, commitment, mutual affection and respect, careful and honest communication, mutual consent, and growth in grace, and in the knowledge and love of God. The reason for the removal is purportedly its addition in 1984, which was believed to be added to target homosexual candidates for ministry. While I could not confirm this claim readily, I do not doubt the claim on its face. However, the language itself, without the prohibitions that were built underneath it, was rather innocuous. A reasonable reading therefore leads one to understand that marriage is no longer necessary for sexual relations in United Methodist teaching. This removal passed by a vote of 544 to 121. Later, by a vote of 474 to 206, delegates approved striking the list of chargeable offences against clergy. Being a self-avowed practicing homosexual, conducting ceremonies which celebrate homosexual unions, or performing same-sex wedding ceremonies. When a proposal was brought forward to add not being celibate in singleness and not being faithful in marriage, delegates voted against adding this to chargeable offences, leaving simply immorality, but leaving it ambiguous as to what constitutes immorality. The next major potential change is one that has long been the desire of the progressives in the United Methodist Church, and that is what is commonly called regionalization. Regionalization is often described like this. America can adapt the Book of Discipline for its own cultural context, and other regions can do the same. Traditionalists have long been opposed to regionalization because of the perceived intentions behind it. The UMC in America has been growing more progressive, and regionalization allows the American church license to sanction various things that are not acceptable in Africa, most notably homosexual clergy and marriage. The desire of the bishops and progressives is that the church remain under one moniker, the United Methodist Church, while allowing for diversity on this issue. The traditionalist argument against regionalization is generally pretty concise. The most common argument is that you cannot contextualize what Scripture has called a sin, referring to the major verses which speak openly against homosexuality, most notably Leviticus 18:22, Romans 1:26-27, and 1 Corinthians 6:9-10. Traditionalists also argue that this contradicts the mission of church, specifically that the denomination would speak with a forked tongue, calling actions sin in one part of the world but not another. The belief is that this weakens the mission of the United Methodist Church, to make disciples for the transformation of the world, by spreading a confused message about what is believed. The disunity easily demonstrates the vast differences in theology of traditional and progressive United Methodists when it comes to the process of interpreting the Bible. You might remember that this vote for regionalization failed in 2019, when it was proposed by the Council of Bishops in the One Church plan, which was often mocked by traditionalists due to accusations of being a deliberately misleading title. The vote at this General Conference was 586 to 164, and this vote is among the most controversial among African delegates. Regionalization has passed General Conference in the past before, though. In 2008, a resolution was approved by General Conference delegates, but it failed at the second step. Because regionalization is a change to the Constitution of the United Methodist Church, it must be ratified by the annual conferences by a 2/3 vote. In 2008, this annual conference step failed to reach the required 2/3. While regionalization is expected to pass this time, the vote will not likely happen this year, with most annual conferences plans for this year having already been set. But what about disaffiliation? The process by which churches were allowed to exit the denomination if they could not agree with the denominational body's actions concerning homosexuality. From 2022 to 2023, 7,658 churches were officially approved to leave the denomination using methods in the Book of Discipline. Hundreds more churches have open lawsuits due to their annual conference's implementation, or more often, extra restrictions, that were unevenly applied across the country. To summarize the entire section, the General Conference has voted to not extend the 2019 disaffiliation pathways for both the United States and all other regions. If you remember, the Council of Bishops had ruled that disaffiliations under paragraph 2553 would not affect central conferences, which are conferences that are outside of the United States, until a year after the conclusion of the 2020 General Conference. Paragraph 2553 also had a sunset clause of December 31, 2023, which means that African churches could never exercise their limited right. This has quite obviously caused quite a bit of controversy on many levels. I will discuss why shortly. For now, African churches can only use a provision of the Book of Discipline that allows entire conferences to leave the denomination. Individual churches have no pathway. This is also an extremely slow process, and it will likely be years before such an exit takes place. And for American traditionalists that waited to see what would happen at General Conference, there is no path to exit outside of paragraph 2549, which is the church closure section. The bishop and the trustees of an annual conference could agree to close the church and transfer the property to the members that wish to leave, but only if that conference leadership allows such a process. And then it is still at the whim of the annual conference voting body to pass the closure, which requires a simple majority vote at the next annual conference, which would be over a year from now. For the hundreds of traditionalists that are part of lawsuits against the conference, if the courts rule in their favor or the court orders negotiations, that creates a hole in the Book of Discipline that allows the annual conference trustees to negotiate freely. Whenever there is a disagreement between local laws and the Book of Discipline on matters not concerning doctrine, the local laws supersede the discipline, so the trustees do not have to use the discipline to come to an agreement with a church. However, every conference is actively fighting these lawsuits in order to keep the churches that want to leave within the denomination. For now, the exit paths for traditionalists are extremely limited. They can pray for benevolent conference leadership to allow them to leave. They can use the legal process and sue in the secular courts, or they can leave on foot for other churches. One decision that is not being commonly talked about is the denomination's position concerning abortion. This has long been a point of contention between traditionalists and progressives, with self-styled centrists landing frequently on either side. The General Conference took solidly progressive action on this issue. A resolution that passed on April 29th stated that the denomination upholds a person's right to an abortion after informed consideration with their family, medical practitioners, pastor, and other pertinent counsel. Further emphasizing the very American concern, it also said, state and federal laws and regulations prohibiting abortion violate a person's right to the full range of reproductive health care and potentially life. This petition also said that the General Conference stands in solidarity with those who seek reproductive health care, to speak for all United Methodists, something that is sure to be untrue. These words, part of the past social principles, were also removed. We are equally bound to respect the sacredness of the life and well-being of the mother and the unborn child. For the traditionalists that remain, this is sure to be a seriously divisive issue, and could cause another schism of its own when its words are realized. Also, of small note to some but politically charged rhetoric in its own right, was the General Conference's petition to divest entirely from the Israel bond market. They also passed a petition that called on the denomination to lobby the United States government to end military aid to Israel. There were many more issues that were discussed, but these were the most powerful issues that were passed at General Conference. And now, I have the sad duty to explain the controversy behind the ordeal. And there are multiple controversies. It begins with something I mentioned in my previous video, building up to the General Conference. There were a total of 862 delegates calculated for this General Conference. The United States, despite being nowhere close to the majority of the denomination, took 55.9% of the voting delegates thanks to a formula that used 2016 membership numbers. Africa had 32% of the delegate counts as a result. The Philippines had 9%, Europe 4.6%, and various other countries having 1.5%. This already does not reflect the demographical truth of the denomination, with the American Church having lost over 1,400,000 members since 2019, but that is only the beginning of the problem. Further complicating matters were the Commission on General Conference's actions. It is the duty of the Commission on General Conference to send out letters of invitation to delegates outside of the United States. However, within 2 months leading up to the General Conference, many delegates in Africa had not received their letters of invitation. These letters are required by most Central Conference delegates in order to be able to apply for a travel visa to the United States. A full quarter of their delegates never arrived due to letters that were late or never sent. Africa, as a result, had over 70 delegates unable to obtain visas in time for the conference, reducing their voting power to well under 24%. America, unsurprisingly, had nearly all of its delegates present. Also, remember that when the over 7,600 traditionalist churches left, the delegates were not replaced with traditionalist votes. The empty delegates from members that left were replaced by alternates, almost fully centrist and progressive. This effectively meant that any traditionalist push would fail from the start, as the combined voting power of the entire rest of the combined worldwide church, even if it were entirely traditional, would not have been enough to pass a simple majority. So there was little reason to resist the votes. However, that doesn't fully explain the vast swing in voting percentage. What else could have caused such a radical policy change? Traditionalists reported openly ahead of General Conference that it was not their intention to fight back against the progressive agenda. Their goal was to only fight for Africa to have a chance to disaffiliate the same way that Americans had. Another reason was the process of the consent calendar. The consent calendar allowed petitions to be combined for the sake of speed and simplicity. Petitions that received 10 or fewer downvotes in individual committees could be combined, and it appears from reports that the committees were disproportionately progressive, meaning nearly all of the most contentious issues were combined together, confusing many delegates, to say nothing of those who watched the live-streamed proceedings. Further, it must be said plainly, Africa was disenfranchised from a right to vote on leaving the denomination by Americans. Progressives vehemently deny this rather obvious matter of record, while also simultaneously claiming that it is for the best that Africa never received their vote. This is rather ironic. Remember that in 2019, traditionalists who had the majority favoured a disaffiliation plan called the Boyette Disaffiliation Plan. It was designed as a simple way for progressives who could not abide or could not in good conscience stay, would be able to leave with their church property for the cost of fulfilling pension obligations to retired clergy. Ultimately, the Taylor Disaffiliation Plan passed, but it was still seen as an olive branch to progressives who wanted to leave. When progressives won the 2024 vote, they instead removed all options to leave and made it more difficult than ever. An odd application of the golden rule if there ever was one. Some of the most tense moments revolved around the language used by speakers. The president of the Council of Bishops at the time, Thomas Bickerton, opened the General Conference with a message that many traditionalists called polemic and tone-deaf. He spent a good portion of his message berating those traditionalists that have left, while admonishing delegates who might want to leave. To quote Bishop Bickerton exactly, "If you are not committed to a positive narrative of who we are and where we are going, you might just be in the wrong place. And perhaps, just perhaps in love, we might just ask you with integrity that you just leave us alone to do our work." A link to the entire sermon is in the description. It appeared, and indeed was, rather disingenuous to tell people to leave, but then block all avenues to do it. Others noted that progressives, rather than allowing for full debate on more contentious issues, instead used their majority power to close debate on petitions and move directly to vote. In one particularly cringe moment to demonstrate this, an African delegate was cut off from their speech, begging for concessions for fellow Africans, for a point of order from an American delegate, who noted they were beyond the session time limit by a few minutes and that they were hungry for lunch. The motion was approved, and they left to eat. A link to this video is time-stamped and in the description. Some of the polemics weren't done with words, but with actions. In the past, African delegates were always given a stipend to purchase their own plane tickets and to buy food suitable for African dietary needs. This year, tickets were purchased for the delegates directly. At first, this might not seem like a serious issue. However, many African delegates come to the States a few days ahead of the General Conference starts in order to adjust to the differences in time zones. Some stay beyond General Conference to visit churches in America, sometimes with churches that have helped financially with their missions, and of course to fellowship. The General Conference purchased tickets that forced delegates to arrive the day before the conference began and leave the following day, allowing for no additional fellowship. Also, delegates from other countries were not given any stipend for their dietary needs. African diets are different from American diets, and the General Conference meals provided were based on American tastes, further dividing the delegates from each other. Some issues involved worship. One of the evening communion services for the delegates was hosted by Bishop Cedric Bridgeforth, an openly homosexual bishop of the Western jurisdiction. Traditionalists found this in significantly bad taste and an example of how regionalization does not solve theological differences. Those who disagree with the position on homosexuality had no real choice if they wished to have communion that evening. This demonstrated that regionalization was not a real solution, as Africa cannot regionalize entirely from American theology, and are forced to accept positions they passionately disagree with. Further, the date for the removal was May 1st, the same date as the launch of the Global Methodist Church 2 years prior. Perhaps a coincidence, but with the number of days on the calendar for General Conference, this was perceived as a spiteful message to traditionalists who had left for the new breakaway denomination. Another issue came from Bishop Karen Olivetto, overseeing one of the plenary sessions of the conference. Bishop Olivetto was the first openly homosexual bishop of the UMC, and also from the Western jurisdiction. Traditionalists who disagree with the direction of the church were given no option but to accept her authority as a bishop, further showing that regionalization is not entirely real, and that Africans and other traditionalists who might disagree have no real say in the organization on matters important to them. Perhaps predictably, the American bishops' responses were positive about the conference, on the whole. Bishop Sue Halpert Johnson, who rather famously and suddenly stopped all disaffiliations 2 days after Christmas in 2022 in the North Georgia Conference, said, "Our book of discipline is now written in a way that includes and welcomes all people, whether they characterize themselves as progressive, centrist, or traditionalist." As an update, traditionalist churches sued the conference, and the courts agreed that they had been unlawfully stripped of a right. Some downplayed the concerns of African disenfranchisement. One particular example of this was from Bishop John Scholl of Eastern Pennsylvania and Greater New Jersey, both conferences with lawsuits by traditionalist churches still attempting to disaffiliate. Scholl said in an email and video, "Central Conference delegates are well represented, actively participating, and hold committee leadership positions, disproving reports of disenfranchisement, not even mentioning the absence of 25% of Africa's voting delegates, or America's overrepresentation in the voting totals." Bishop Thomas Berlin of the Florida Conference said, "I know that you will have church members who view these changes in a variety of ways. It is my expectation as the Bishop of the Florida Conference that we will respect each other in the unity of Jesus Christ, understanding that we have a variety of perspectives and serve in a multitude of contexts and locations." It should also be noted that Thomas Berlin also called the Traditionalist Plan of 2019 a virus that would destroy American churches. Links to all of these quotes are in the description, but there are words that the leadership of the United Methodist Church not only refuses to apologize for, but seems to use to actively antagonize traditionalists. One thing worth mentioning in addition to the quotes is that the bishops have promised that traditionalist churches that object will not receive clergy, or will be forced to conduct services that go against their convictions. There is a numerical problem that will likely occur. Traditionalist clergy are sparse, and the average age of a United Methodist clergy person is 54 years old. New clergy entering the United Methodist Church are by a huge margin not traditionalist, so it remains to be seen how those churches' pulpits will be filled in the years to come. It also remains to be seen how this will be viewed through the lens of Bishop Bickerton's call to traditionalists that are dissatisfied to just leave us alone to do our work. But what have African delegates said? The response of African delegates came a few days after the votes in a press release, while the General Conference was still actively in session. I will provide a link in the description to the entire statement, but this paragraph in particular is now a part of the legacy. "We must now return to Africa and tell our people that the General Conference did not listen to us, does not value us as partners, and is willing to lose us to pursue its liberal Western agenda." The breakaway denomination, the Global Methodist Church, initially said it would not issue any comments on the decisions of the UMC General Conference, but did release this statement after the change in doctrine. The Global Methodist Church is aware of recent decisions made by the General Conference of the United Methodist Church with respect to its definition of marriage and its ordination standards. The Global Methodist Church operates independently from the United Methodist Church, and therefore we do not have any affiliation with their decisions, nor do we wish to comment or provide commentary on the actions of other religious organizations. While the denomination kept its distance officially, most Global Methodist clergy, who were until 2 years ago United Methodist clergy, still expressed sadness. Every Global Methodist commentator said candidly that they knew the change was coming, but it still hurt to see it happen, despite their disaffiliation. All of these events lead me neatly to the historical value. If there is one obvious takeaway, it is that the unity in the United Methodist Church is gone. While I have again tried to do research in both directions, none of the bishops I researched for this video took any time to seriously address the concerns of traditionalists who raised complaints. nor did any return my email requests. Bishops also appear to be more than ignoring the traditionalists that remain. They appear to have an open disdain for them, not addressing their concerns, nor working for equality or fairness. Traditionalist leaders, meanwhile, are well aware of the direction and the struggle they face moving forward and are eager to talk about it. They also have the receipts and timestamps, so my story strongly favours them, though it is not for lack of trying. Progressives in the United Methodist Church wish to say they are the continuation, but have quite obviously moved far away from the theology and legacy of their founder, John Wesley, and seem to have only lip service to thoughts of genuine unity. And while there is a front of happiness from the United Methodist leadership on stage, this has appeared to be a little wishful or perhaps hoping to manifest something that isn't there. A joint legacy is over. It is a broken legacy now. Please like and subscribe if this has been helpful. Cheers.